Okay, hi everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm sure Rabbi Kaplan covered a lot of things. I mean, this parsha is actually, we really shouldn't say one parsha is more interesting than another parsha, but there are so many different interesting questions in this parsha. You know, in Ohr Somayach, one of the topics that we discuss a lot, Rabbi Gottlieb especially, is the various proofs that the Torah is of divine origin. So I'm going to give you a non-academic proof that the Torah must come from God, and that is, if we were writing our own story, we would not put all the stuff that's in the Torah that reflects maybe poorly upon us. So it has to come from God, because we would write the story a different way. Would we write the idea that Yaakov gained the blessings through deception? Would we write the narrative of Mechiras Yosef, the sale of Yosef, which is a blot, really, upon the people, the Jewish people? All of the sins of the desert, the golden calf, right? So in many, many ways, I understand it's a non-academic proof, but one of the indicators that the Torah is not simply a man-made document is that the Torah portrays us sometimes in not the most favorable light. But be it as it may, the parsha begins with Rivka. So again, Yitzchak was 40 years old. Let's be sure we got the chronology right here. Yitzchak was 40 years old when he married Rivka. Now, the Torah does not tell us how old Rivka was, but as you know, there are different views in Chazal. Chazal have one shita that Rashi brings that Rivka was only 3 years old. So that means there's a 37-year difference between them. And many people find it unbelievable. How could you be 3 years old? But nevertheless, she was obviously very mature for her age. She's drawing water for the camels and the like. And the truth is, when I came to Israel, I understood it much better, because sometimes you go to a makolet, like, 12 midnight, and some tiny little kid is like lugging a whole thing of milk. I don't know how the kid is up, but whatever it is. So Lamaisa, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, can do stuff that, we don't used to. Americans, we don't gain our independence till we're like 32 or something. But, in other societies, children were very, very active. But there is another view in Tosfos, just to be aware of this, that Rivka was 14 years old, which is still young, but still, a little more understandable. But be it as it may, there was a great, great difference in age between Yitzchak and Rivka, either the difference between 40 and 3 or 40 and 14, still a very, very big difference in age. The Netziv makes an observation that you see that the relationship of Yitzchak and Rivka, so this is a very modern observation, it almost sounds like a pop psychology. He says was very different than the relationship of Avram and Sarah. Avram and Sarah had kind of a relationship of equality, in the sense that when there's a problem with the kids, right? Sarah sees Yishmael as a very bad influence. So what does Sarah do? Sarah goes to Avram and tells him exactly, hey, we got a problem here. Yishmael is going to destroy the spiritual foundations of our family, and therefore he has to be sent away. And Avram had difficulty accepting that, because he was the man of loving kindness and the like. And what did God say? God said, whatever Sarah says, you listen to her. Now, Rivka is confronted with kind of a very similar situation, in which you have these two twins. You have Yaakov and Eisav, and Yaakov is the righteous tzaddik, and Eisav is the hunter and the person that commits many, many sins. And Yitzchak, for reasons I'll get to, seems to favor Eisav, because perhaps he doesn't fully understand the situation. And instead of Rivka having a discussion with him, as Sarah had vis-a-vis Ishmael, Rivka has to engage in a whole deception, in which Yaakov has to impersonate Eisav and get the brachos. You see, it's almost the identical problem, but they deal with it in very, very different ways. Sarah deals with it by direct communication. Rivka deals with it by subterfuge. And the Netziv actually writes, because Rivka was in awe of Yitzchak, both because of the age differential, that's one aspect of it, but more than that, because Yitzchak was an Akedah, Yitzchak was a korban, Yitzchak was otherworldly. Like Yitzchak was like an angel. Yitzchak was kind of not within the normal bounds of a human being. That's why he was not allowed to leave the land of Israel. Like you notice that when there was a famine in Avram's time, Avram went to Mitzrayim. When there's a famine in Yitzchak's time, Hashem says specifically, you are not allowed to leave the land of Israel, because the land of the Philistines is still the land. Yitzchak went to the Philistines, but the Philistines is still the land of Israel. The Pelishtim simply occupied the Mediterranean coast. Gaza, for example, was a Philistine city, but it's within the borders of Eretz Yisrael. So why was Avram allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael and Yitzchak was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael? And he's the only one of the patriarchs, right? Yaakov certainly spent many, many years outside of the land of Israel, and the short answer is because he was sanctified as a korban, his holiness did not allow him to leave the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. So the Netziv said that had an impact on the marital relationship between Yitzchak and Rivka, that Rivka had a sense of awe with Yitzchak, and as a result, she was not able to present things as directly as Sarah was able to present. Again, that sounds like a kind of a modern, you almost feel like you're going to see it on a PBS special or whatever it is about marital communication. But the Netziv says, indeed, one of the lessons we learn is that in the relationship of the Avos and the Imahos, there were sometimes different communication styles to deal with the problem of good kid, bad kid. Now, there are two transactions in the Parsha, and it's important that you understand the difference between them. Transaction number one is the purchase of the birthright. Transaction number two is the getting of the blessings. So one is called the Bechorah, and one is called the Bracha. Now, you have to be sure you understand exactly the difference between these two transactions. First of all, let's look at the ages in which it occurred. How old, because Yaakov and Esau were the same age. Eisav is, 1 minute older because Eisav came out first, but Yaakov and Esau are twins. How old were Yaakov and Esau when Yaakov bought the Bechorah from Esau? Remember, Esau came back hunting, and he was starving, and Yaakov was cooking a lentil stew, like a vegetarian cholent, and he basically said, I'll give you the stew if you sell me the birthright, and Esau sold the birthright. So how old? So Rashi learns they were 15 years old at the time. 15 years old. Now, why was that important? Because that was the day that Avram Avinu died. Avram Avinu died when Yaakov and Esau were 15. How can we prove that? Actually, it's very simple proof. Yitzchak was born when Avram was 100. Yitzchak had Yaakov and Esau when he was 60. So Avram Avinu was 160 years old when his grandchildren were born. Avram died at 175. So as a result, Avram died when Yaakov and Esau were 15 years old. Rashi understands, based on Chazal, that the reason that Yaakov is cooking a lentil stew is lentils is one of the foods you give to somebody who is mourning. And he was making the lentil stew to give to Avram, to be Menachem Avel. Why is lentils a food you give to mourners? Because it's oval. Eggs are the same idea. And that reminds a person that even though there are bad times, there's a circle of life that goes from the bad to the good, and therefore don't despair. So as a result, the whole story of the Nazid, of the lentil stew, was Nicham Avelim. Yaakov was comforting his father for losing Avraham, and that is when he bought the Bechorah. Now, what is the Bechorah? What does it mean, the right of the firstborn? Now, later in the Torah, we do have a law that a firstborn gets a double portion of inheritance, but that law was not operative at that time. So, at that time, the only thing the Bechorah meant was the right to do the divine service within the family, meaning before there were Kohanim, the Zechus Avoda, the one who would bring korbanos on behalf of the family, was the Bechor. In fact, even in Mitzrayim and after Mitzrayim, originally the divine service was done by the firstborn, except because they participated in the Chedo Egel, so it moved from the Bechor to the Kohen. But certainly before the Chedo Egel, the Avoda was with Bechor, which means a Bechor, having the rights of a firstborn in those days, did not have any monetary aspect to it. It was totally the right to perform spiritual avodah. By the way, it's a little aside. Let me point out a very interesting chiddush of the Ohr HaChaim, the great commentary Ohr HaChaim, where the Ohr HaChaim actually says that since avodah was originally belonging to the Bechor, and Bechor only lost it because of the Chedo Egel, so in the Messianic era, where all evil will be rectified and the Chedo Egel will be atoned, for the third Beis HaMikdash, the divine service will no longer be Kohanim and Leviim. The divine service will go back to the Bechor. So if any of you are a Bechor, okay, so it might be that you'll be the Kohen. You'll be the equivalent of the Kohen. Now, I don't want to get into the Ohr HaChaim. The Ohr HaChaim is very, very schwer, very, very, very difficult. First of all, the Rambam, one of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith is that the Torah is not going to be changed. That even when Mashiach comes, we're going to keep the Torah. We're going to bring korbanos and the like. Now, if the Torah says Kohanim do the Avodah, how can you posit that when the Messianic era comes, the Torah structure is going to be changed? I mean, it's a very, very difficult hanacha of the Ohr HaChaim. So not everybody agrees. I don't want to get your confidence up, your hopes too high. But this is a chiddush of the Ohr HaChaim. Now, it's interesting, the Arizal says another chiddush, which is also a peculiar chiddush, but it's a very different chiddush. The Arizal says, Kohanim and Leviim are going to change jobs. In other words, the Kohen will become the Levi, and the Levi will become the Kohen. So not Bechor, Kohen Levi are going to switch. And this is based on another consideration. Al Pi Kabbalah, Kohen represents the midah of mercy, rachamim, and Levi represents the midah of din. In this world, because we're so imperfect, the dominant koach that Hashem has to use in this world is rachamim, so the Kohen is number one. But liyasid lavo, the world is in a higher state of perfection. It'll be based on din, and therefore the Levi, that is din, becomes number one. This is, you may have heard, a corollary of this is the Ari's famous teaching that liyasid lavo, the halacha is going to be like Beit Shammai over Beis Hillel, meaning we have many machlokim, Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, and normally, not all the time, but normally Beis Hillel is the lenient one, and Beit Shammai is the strict one, and the halacha is like Beis Hillel. So the Arizal says, since we live in a world of rachamim, the halacha has to bend to accommodate a certain leniency, and that is why the law follows Beis Hillel. But liyasid lavo, after the Mashiach comes, we're on a higher level of perfection. We go back to strict din. So objectively, Beit Shammai is going to be dominant, and that's the same idea of the switch of Kohen Levi. So we have at least three paradigms here, each of which you could develop. Paradigm one is the pashtus of the Rambam, that the Torah doesn't change. If the Torah says Kohanim do the service and Leviim assist them, that's going to be exactly, Mashiach will be exactly Kohen, Levi, just like now, which is the Pashut Pshat. Then we have the Ohr HaChaim, who says the Bechor is going to take over. And then we have the Arizal that says Kohen and Levi are going to switch their roles. What's the halacha? Who knows? I mean, I can't give you a psak halacha on this. And I also want to point out that you have to understand a big thing about all of these different svaras, that Yemot HaMashiach itself is not static. Yemot HaMashiach can be a period of thousands and thousands of years. So when we say Yemot HaMashiach, certain changes will occur, that doesn't mean right away. So it could very well be that all of these different stages will take place at various points in Yemot HaMashiach. Meaning, Maybe initially it'll be Kohen Levi like we have now, and then at some point there'll be a switch of Kohen Levi, and maybe at some later point the Bechor. Right? Now, in other words, a lot of times, this is an important thing just to be aware of, when you have different discussions of what will happen, Yemot HaMashiach, they're not necessarily contradictory because different things can happen at different stages. Again, I'll make the point. Yemot HaMashiach can be thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You see? Because there'll still be death. Mashiach will die. There'll be son of Mashiach. You see, don't confuse the days of Mashiach with Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead. These are two different stages. Initially, Mashiach comes before resurrection of the dead. So even when Mashiach comes, people are still going to die, including Mashiach is going to die and be replaced by son of Mashiach. At some later point, and we don't know when, there will be resurrection of the dead, and that'll be eternal. But that's not the same as Yemot HaMashiach. Okay, again, just to digress for a moment, be sure you understand the difference between three terms, very, very important. Olam Haba, Yemot HaMashiach, Techias HaMesim. Three different stages of the end of days. Olam Haba is where your soul, hopefully, goes to when you die. When a person dies, they may have to go to Gehenna for a while, etc. But eventually, they go to a spiritual world. Olam Haba is not physical. There is no body. There is no eating. There is no drinking. There is no guf. It is simply the soul that separates from the physicality of the body and is united with God in the infinite pleasures of Olam Haba. That's Olam Haba, right? So, in a sense, the very words, the very phrase Olam Haba is a bit of a misnomer because it's not a world that's in the future. Olam Haba exists right now, right? Your grandparents or your great-grandparents, they're in Olam Haba. So it's called the world to come only because vis-a-vis me, I'm not there yet, so I call it the world to come. But it is a present reality that exists right now. Now, the coming of Mashiach is very different. The coming of Mashiach is going to happen in this world. There will be a person that God has designated who will be a descendant of David HaMelech. He will reestablish the Davidic monarchy. He will usher in world peace. He will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And all of the world, even the non-Jews, will not become Jewish, but they will believe in God and embrace the morality of the Noahide laws, etc. And that is Mashiach. So Mashiach is in Olam Hazeh. And people, as I just said, are still going to die. But, there'll be in fact, the Rambam writes, the Messianic era, life will still be normal in a lot of ways. In other words, it's not going to be supernatural. You're still going to have to go to work. You're still going to have to wait for a bus, and the buses will be more crowded when Mashiach comes. A lot of the daily frustrations of life, sometimes people say, when Mashiach comes, I'm not going to have to pay taxes, my braces will be covered. Not necessarily. You'll still have to figure out how to make money, but it is going to be a beautiful world, a world of peace, a world of godliness. But it'll be within the confines of Teva. That's the Rambam Shita. Now, then there's a third stage that comes, and that is the eventual resurrection of the dead, where body and soul get united. In a sense, Olam Haba collapses into Olam Hazeh. In other words, everything gets united, and that's the final eternal joy of the ultimate reward in which body and soul are both nana, mi ziv ha-shechina. They get the pleasure of ziv ha-shechina. So be sure you understand the differences in those terms.
What's the second one again? The second one?
Yemot HaMashiach, meaning there is Olam Haba, there's the Messianic era, then there's Techias HaMesim. In fact, we talk about this on the Shabbos davening. Before Kel Adon, after Baruch Hu, so we say, Ein ke'erkecha Hashem Elokeinu b'olam hazeh. There is no one like you, God, in this world. That's just this world. Ve'ein zu lascha malkeinu l'chayei olam haba. There is no one besides you for the life of olam haba. Efes biltecha gayaleinu limos hamashiach. There is no one besides you in giving us the days of Mashiach. V'yein domeh lecha moshienu. There was no one comparable to your saving us for techiyas hamesim. So there are 4 things mentioned there. Olam hazeh, which is just the life we have now. So that I'm not counting, but it's mentioned. Olam hazeh, olam haba, yemos hamashiach, techiyas hamesim. And that's the chronological sequence, because Olam Haba you go to right now when a person dies. So Olam Haba, number 1. 2nd, days of Mashiach. Number 2. 3 is resurrection of the dead, Techiyas HaMesim. So, I have no idea why I got onto this. Anyone remember what I was, okay. What was I saying?
Yaakov's Bechorah.
Okay, yeah, Derech Chaim, right, you got it, okay. So, when Yaakov is proposing to Eisav, I want to buy your Bechorah, he's not really cheating him out of anything. He's just telling Eisav, listen, you don't care about this stuff. I want the merit of doing the divine service. So when Eisav says, it's very important, behold, I am going to die. Who needs this Bechorah? So if you read it superficially, he's simply saying, I am so starving, I'm going to drop dead, so here, take what you want. There's a much deeper meaning. He's actually saying, I don't believe in the afterworld. No, when you die, you're gone. So my philosophy of life is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we're gone. You see, it's a different picture. It's not that, the way we understand it, Eisav is so desperately starving. And Yaakov is taking advantage of a starving man. It's a different point. Eisav is saying, I don't care about this. This is not important to me. And the Torah describes it. Vayivez Eisav es habechorah. He despised it. Wasn't worth a thing. There's no olam haba. There's no Mashiach. There's nothing. So who needs this divine service? I live for hedonism. I live for gratification. So, that happened when Yaakov and Eisav were 15 years old. Now, was Yitzchak and Rivka aware of that transaction? I would have to say yes, actually, because avodah was a public thing. I mean, if they saw that Yaakov was the one bringing the korbanos, and they might have wondered, hey, isn't Eisav the firstborn? In other words, the point I'm making is, well before the story of the brachos, Yitzchak must be aware that it's Yaakov that is doing the spiritual service of the family. Now, the story of the brachos is many, many years later. And Rashi gives us a very complicated cheshbon that Yaakov and Eisav were 63 years old at the time. 63 years old. That means Yitzchak was 123 years old, because Yitzchak was 60. Okay? So we have the Bechorah at 15, and we have the brachos at 63. Now, the brachos essentially involve not the right to do divine service. That's the Bechorah. The brachos are essentially involved who gets Eretz Yisrael, who gets the land of Israel, right? Who will yarshin God's promise to Avram and to Yitzchak that your seed will get Eretz Yisrael. It was that Yitzchak wanted to give to Eisav. So what I'm saying is, contrary to what some people think, that somehow Yitzchak thought Eisav was the better person, it's very clear Yitzchak did not think Eisav was the better person. First of all, Yitzchak already knows that that Yaakov bought the Bechorah. So he already knows that. Second of all, if you remember, when Yaakov is wearing the goat skin, so his arms are hairy like Esau, so Yitzchak, who's not able to see very well, Yitzchak remarks a very famous verse, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, and the hands are the hands of Esau. So what does Rashi say? Rashi says it doesn't mean Yaakov and Esau had different sounding voices. Their voices, like twins, were more or less the same. But Yaakov mentions the name of Hashem, and Esau doesn't. And since Yaakov mentioned Hashem, which means Yitzchak knows that Yaakov mentions Hashem and Esau doesn't. So he knows Yaakov is more righteous. And the third proof that Yitzchak knows that Yaakov is more righteous is the idea that right before the story of the brachos, the Torah mentions Eisav took 2 Canaanite women as wives, and the Torah says this was a bitter pill. This was something bitter for Yitzchak and Rivka. So the idea that somehow Yitzchak was tricked into thinking Eisav was a better person than Yaakov clearly is not true. He certainly knew that Yaakov was more righteous. But here is Yitzchak's thinking. Let me show you what Yitzchak's thinking was. And it mamish parallels what we see later. We have later Shevet Levi. Shevet Levi does not get a portion in the land of Israel. Right? Shevet Levi does not, they have 48 cities, but they don't get a regular portion in the land of Israel. Why does Shevet Levi not get a regular portion of the land of Israel? Because God wanted them to be free from all of the responsibilities of ownership of land and building a society, so they should be totally devoted to divine service, Torah learning, and prayer. So this was Yitzchak's thought. Yitzchak's thought was, Yaakov is kind of the Levi. I mean, I'm getting ahead. Levi's not born yet, but Yaakov is the Levi of the family. Yaakov shall be devoted to Torah and mitzvos and ruchnius, and I will give Eisav Eretz Yisrael. So he will be involved in building a society, digging ditches, irrigating fields, creating cities. And Yitzchak said, this will be good for Yaakov and for Eisav. It'll be good for Yaakov because Yaakov will not have the distractions of running a material society. And it'll be good for Eisav because Eisav is not a man who can learn all day. Eisav needs to play basketball. Eisav needs to start businesses. Eisav needs to be doing things. So Yitzchak's cheshbon was, he loved Eisav. That much is true. He did love Eisav. And he thought to himself, maybe by giving Eisav the gashmias, the materialism, and giving Yaakov the ruchnias, Eisav will use his material resources to help Yaakov. Similar, give you another similarity to what later happened with the tribes Yisachar and Zevulun, right? Remember that? Yisachar, the tribe of Yisachar, were people who were devoted to full-time Torah study. The tribe of Zevulun were involved in maritime commerce. And Zevulun supported Yisachar's learning, and as a result, Zevulun gets equal reward with Yisachar in Yisachar's learning. So Yitzchak actually envisions a Yisachar-Zevulun partnership with Yaakov and Eisav. Okay, so it's not that he thought Eisav was a bigger tzaddik. It's the other way around. He thought, I'll give Eisav the Gashmias and Yaakov the Ruchnias, and by Eisav getting the Gashmias, Eisav will achieve redemption because he's going to use the material resources to be able to help Yaakov. And mitzad Yaakov, Yaakov will be freed of all of those responsibilities. So Yitzchak thought this was a really good idea. So where did he make a mistake? He made a mistake because he underestimated the depravity of Eisav. He simply thought, okay, Eisav can't sit in the base medrash all day. Okay, Eisav needs to play basketball. Eisav needs to have startup companies. Eisav needs to be involved in business. Maybe he has ADD, whatever it would be. So I'll give him the Olam Hazeh, but he for sure is going to help Yaakov. Rivka understood that that's not what the Eisavs of the world are going to do. The Eisavs of the world are not going to help the Yaakovs. The Eisav of the world are going to destroy the Yaakovs. And therefore we have to give Yaakov not only the birthright, but we have to give him the sholita, the rulership, so to speak, over Eretz Yisrael, so that Yaakov will have a material world to create the infrastructure that could ultimately support the spiritual mission. Because everyone's modeh. The spiritual mission needs a material infrastructure. We need fields, we need agriculture, we need industry, we need a society to be able to support the study of Torah. But instead of giving that away to Eisav, it needs to remain, so to speak, that Yaakov has both of those aspects. So you see that this is an interesting machlokas between Yitzchak and Rivka. And Rivka was considered to be more superior here simply because Rivka was used to deception and hypocrisy in a way that Yitzchak was not. Rivka grew up in the home of Lavan, the famous cheater who cheats Yaakov much, much later on. So Rivka understood that appearances are very deceiving. So Eisav may look like he's somewhat of a righteous person, you see, but in reality, and Yitzchak was fooled because Yitzchak did not understand duplicity. Yitzchak did not understand dishonesty. Rivka understood duplicity and dishonesty, and therefore she understood that Eisav was not able to get the brachas. But I do want to say, though, I think there's something very powerful here. Let's go back to the Bechira story for a moment, the story of the birthright. So I told you that Rashi understands that happened when they were 15 years old, and this was the day that Avram Avinu died. That's why Yaakov is making the lentils. So Rashi brings, Eisav did not openly become a rasha till that day. That day he killed people and he murdered and committed adultery and the like. Meaning Eisav did not become a rasha till the day Avraham died. So how do you understand that? Well, what's the cause and effect here? So one way of understanding it is, this is part of God's promise to Avraham that you will be buried in a good old age, meaning God is promising Avraham, you will not see any of your children or descendants become evil in your lifetime. That's why even Yishmael did tshuva, and Eisav was not a rasha till later, meaning it's kind of God's blessing to Avraham that when you die, all will be good. But I would like to suggest maybe a different explanation. I would like to suggest, and we see this in real life all the time, that Avraham was the one figure that Eisav was able to connect to, meaning Yitzchak had standards of holiness, and Eisav could not reach those standards of holiness. But Avraham was the Zaidi. Avraham was the kind, compassionate grandfather that even the rebellious Eisav was able. I mean, I think it's very touching in some ways, meaning to say, Eisav was, you would say, a bad kid. I'm simplifying, obviously. Eisav was a kid at risk. Eisav was a kid who could not live by the standards of Yitzchak and Rivka. Eisav could not be in the Beis HaMedrash. In many ways, Eisav might be a disappointment. But he was able to connect to his grandfather. And as long as his grandfather was alive, Eisav remained relatively righteous. And it's only with the death of Abraham that Eisav lost it. The truth is, I mean, this is a picture that I see all the time. It's maybe you have had experiences yourself. Many kids can relate better to their grandparents than to their parents, because parents are in charge of disciplining you, right? Grandmas just bake cookies. It's not the same thing. So a person may have all sorts of conflicts with their father and mother, but they can sometimes feel in their grandparent someone who understands them. Now, again, I'm always a little reluctant to psychoanalyze the Chumash that way, but it just strikes me very much that this idea that Esau became a Russia when Abraham died, I just have a gut feeling that it is connected to that idea that Abraham was the one who was able to understand him in a way that his own parents were not able. Which means, in that sense, we look at Esau as a bad guy, Russia. And that's all true. It is all true. But on the other hand, I think Esau is also a tragic figure. What he might have been, what he might have become. I mean, after all, Esau came from a very good family. Esau came from Yitzchak and Rebekah. Esau was the grandson of Abraham. And Esau had a lot of potential that perhaps could have been realized. And the tragedy was that he lost that support that might have sustained him, and he became the Russia that he became. But Rav Shrodran used to say that if Eisav were to walk into this room, if Eisav were to walk into this room right now, you would think you were looking at the Gadol Hador. You would think you would look, meaning all of the evil of Eisav is really by comparison to Yaakov. But in point of fact, Eisav too had many kochos. And this is something we need to recognize, because this goes back to the idea that children, kids, adult kids as well, have different talents and different abilities. And sometimes when you try to push somebody in a certain direction that they're not made for, they rebel and even become a Russia, but they could have been steered in a different direction. This is what Shlomo HaMelech says, Chanoch l'nar al pi darko. You must educate, in Mishlei, you must educate a child according to his way. Everybody has their way. You got to follow that derech. You try to put a square peg in a round hole or a round peg in a square hole, it's going to break. You got to find the right framework. And that's a major challenge in raising children. And it's a major challenge in educating kids of any age, really, in yeshivos or whatever it is, to try to create a framework that is attuned to the uniqueness of their personality. Because then they will grow and then they will thrive. When you try to break and manipulate someone into a certain framework, then it can often be very destructive. And that's in some ways the tragedy of Eisav. And that's why Yitzchak wanted to salvage that by giving Eisav the Gashmias. So Yitzchak was trying to rectify the problems of the early years. Problem was, too little, too late. Meaning, what could have worked at age 15 can't work at age 63. Age 63 already, you're a little too set in your ways, right? So, I think there's a lot of interesting Torah psychological dynamics in analyzing the story of Yaakov and Esau. One final word I want to mention to you, and that is when Yaakov is standing before Yitzchak with the hairy goat skins, and Yitzchak thinks it's Eisav, but it mentions Vayarech es reach begadav. Yitzchak smelled the scent, the aroma of the garments, and he said, this is the field that Hashem has blessed. So Chazal have a very interesting drasha that the word begadav, garments, without vowels, could be read Bogdav. Bogdav means the rebellious, treacherous ones. That Yitzchak had a nevuah. Now he thought the person standing in front of him was Eisav. He didn't know it was Yaakov. But whatever it is, he had a vision of evil descendants, Rishayim. And he saw that even the most evil of these descendants ultimately is blessed by God. And the Medrash tells us this is referring to Jewish renegades. Again, Yitzchak didn't know it was referring to the Jewish people. He thought it was Eisav. And the Gemara gives the story of a man who was called Yosef Meshisa. And Yosef Meshisa lived during the destruction of the Second Temple. And he was a renegade. He was a traitor. He actually assisted the Romans in destroying the Beis HaMikdash. And as a reward, the Romans told him, okay, you can go into the temple and take whatever souvenir, whatever treasure you want, you can keep it. So he went into the temple and he took out the menorah. I'm not sure how he moved the menorah by himself. It's pretty heavy, but he took out the menorah, which is a gold menorah. It's worth quite a lot. So the Romans said, well, we don't mean that, get something small. We're not going to give you the menorah. And they told him, go back in, take something else, a gold coin or something. And he said, I desecrated the temple once. All of a sudden he became a Baal Tshuva. I'm not going to go in again. And the Romans ordered him to go into the temple, and he refused. And he was tortured painfully. And he died al Kiddush Hashem. This is what we call the Pinta L'Yid, the spark of a Jew. That even the Jew who seems to leave everything, even the Jew who rejects Hashem, in his innermost essence, there is a holiness that is waiting to go out. That's Yosef Meshisa, and Chazal say that is what Yitzchak intuited when he smelled, so to speak. He perceived even the Bogdav, the rebellious, treacherous ones, are like a field that Hashem has blessed. Again, he thought he was seeing Esav's descendants. In fact, he was seeing Yaakov's descendants. And that's a beautiful idea, that every Jew is righteous on the inside, even if they're not righteous on the outside. There is holiness and goodness within. And finally, it's brought down in Sifrei Chasidus that Yaakov uses the word my son, B'ni, 8 times. When he thinks he's talking to Esau, but he's talking to Yaakov, he says, B'ni, B'ni, my son, 8 times. So there's an interesting Gemara that says that when Avshalom, who was King David HaMelech's son, was killed. Now remember, Avshalom wanted not only to depose his father, Avshalom wanted to kill his father. And when Avshalom was killed, David HaMelech cried and said, I wish I would die instead of him. And he said, Avshalom, my son, my son, my son, my son. He said it 8 times. The Gemara explains, the first 7 times are to bring his son out of the 7 compartments of Gehenna. Gehenna has 7 floors, sub-basement, sub-basement, sub-basement. Each declaration of my son elevated him high, to a better place. And the 8th got him into Olam Haba. This is the Gemara. So the Hasidic Shavort says that when Yaakov sees the rebellious, sinful Jews, when Yitzchak sees the rebellious, sinful Jews, although he thinks they're Esav's children, but he sees these rebellious people, he too wants to elevate them away from the lowest of Gehennims to Olam Haba. So he says, B'ni, 8 times, exactly for the same reason that David did it for Avshalom. Now, maybe you've seen this, in the Kidron Valley, between the walls of the old city and the Mount of Olives, right? Little valley. So there's a monument there. And that's called Yad Avshalom, the monument of Avshalom. Either it's Avshalom's grave or it's a monument that he built. Now, the truth of the matter is, many say it's from the Crusaders, many say We don't necessarily have a Masorah that it's from Avshalom, but it's called the Monument of Avshalom. You're familiar with what I'm talking about? If you ever wander out there, you'll see a kind of a fancy little structure. So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz used to like to daven there. And that's a peculiar place to choose to daven. I mean, you have the Kaisel right there, and you have the Kevorim of Tzaddikim. Why would you daven by the grave of Avshalom? Avshalom was not a righteous person. What would make it a significant makam for tefillah? So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz said a beautiful thought. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz said that Avshalom reminds us that a father's love for a child is so complete and unconditional that no matter what the child does, even if the child tries to kill him, the father seeks mercy for his child. So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz said, when I daven at Avshalom's grave or Avshalom's monument, I say to Hashem, Hashem, we are your children. Perhaps we are not worthy, perhaps we are not deserving, but remember the love that David had for the unworthy Avshalom. And can't you have the same love for us? So he felt that the grave of Avshalom was a wonderful place to seek divine mercy. Okay, you'll have a good Chodesh, and see you in Shabbat.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.